Lesson 36. We're going to kind of bridge into chapter 15 from chapter 14 tonight. Um, and the next couple of weeks, I think, will be uh, not always cutting off in the most convenient places, but it's just, you can only go so far in an hour and a half. So um, next week, I think we'll be in a situation where we'll be kind of halfway through the crucifixion. So uh, it's just bear with me. We'll kind of make it through this as we go, and we'll see how it works out. But tonight we want to look at Peter denying Jesus, and then we're going to look at Jesus with Pilate. So let me read this first part, which is chapter 14, verses 66 through 72. I apologize in advance. I've tried to proofread this lesson sheet. I did this at about 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting in LAX the other day. So nothing better to do. Couldn't sleep, so put it together. So hopefully there's not too many typos in this thing. But um, if it looks a little convoluted at times, that's probably the reason why. I'll try to be less convoluted tonight. Mark 14, verses 66 through 72 says, Now, as Peter was below in the courtyard, well, let me pause. If you remember last week, Jesus was there and he was being investigated by the Sanhedrin. And we had seen there'd been just a brief look toward Peter outside in verse 54 that he was at a distance. And so now that we've seen Jesus with the Sanhedrin, and then they're going to pop back up at the very beginning of 15. So we're kind of going back and forth here in somewhat concurrent or consecutive accounts is kind of what's going on here. So verse 66 says, Now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, You also are with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again, and began to say to those who stood by, This is one of them. But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it. Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. Second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he thought about it, he wept. So I know that in a couple of the Gospels, it's before the cock crows, and here it's before the cock crows twice. Um, I'm not going to try to correlate that. The fact is, some have said that, a cock crowing was not that unusual. Um, Peter maybe didn't even notice it the first time, but when the second time came, it got his attention. So you can kind of take that and run with it, if you will. Um, and I think it's Luke. I seem to remember reading it that when the cock crows, he looks up and Jesus is looking at him, which is that's that's got a very dramatic kind of feel to it, and that just because Mark doesn't mention that doesn't mean that that didn't happen as well. So we just have to always remember that these guys have different reasons for what they write and to whom they write. And so sometimes they focus more on things than other times. So that's kind of typical. But so again, he had this all going on while Jesus was with the Sanhedrin. And um, at least one of the writers I read made the point that we had seen back in verse 54 that, yeah, Peter was going to blow it big time, but he was concerned enough about Jesus that he was nearby. He had followed him at risk to himself. And so, but that boldness that he has seems to really melt away when he's questioned by this slave girl. And you think about it. I mean, she was a slave girl. She was literally of herself personally was of no danger to him. Now you could say, well, she could run off and grab somebody and bring them back. Yeah, that's a reasonable statement. But she in and of herself should not have been much of a risk to this seasoned fisherman, for what it's worth. But it's interesting. And what do you guys? Somebody have an NIV? in your hot little hand. John, what is your verse 67? How does that read?
Says, when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were also with that Nazarene Jesus, she said.
Yeah, do you hear the different tone that you're with that Nazarene, Jesus? Almost universally, the scholars believe that she wasn't just saying this for informational purposes, that there was a certain level of contempt in her voice as she said this to Peter, which may have just gotten the tone off on the wrong track to start with. But different writers have actually kind of even pointed that a little bit more based on the original Greek of that. So it wasn't just you're with this Jesus of Nazareth. You were that Nazarene Jesus. So there seemed to be some discomfort on her part with the fact that Peter was there. And we can talk about that as we go through this. But when Peter denies it, he says, I need to know and understand what you're saying. It really does take on the form of a very legal denial, kind of one of those, I can either, how is it they say, I can either confirm nor deny, or no comment, kind of thing. It's kind of very patterned in that way. And so, but also, I want you to, I think I've heard this maybe said wrong at times in the past. It says he began to curse and to swear. It's not so much that he was some kind of, all of a sudden it become some kind of foul mouth being out there. It's more of a curse from the standpoint of bringing a curse on himself. May I be cursed if that was the case, that I was with that man. I swear to you that I have never been with him, and I would be cursed if I was, and you'd be cursed if you continue to follow me on that. So it's not like cursing and swearing like he's a blah, 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 blah. That's not what he was doing there. It was more of really making an oath, if you will, that he was not with Jesus, right? Because we know from the New Testament, people would do that. They would swear by the temple and swear by all kinds of different things, right? So that's kind of the idea that we've got there. So let me pause. Questions or comments before I get into my questions. Preston, are we going to see you tonight, or are you going to go incognito?
I've
Really
got no
incognito.
camera for some reason.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. As long as you got audio, we can deal with that. So I got you dark, and I got Trent hazy. So he's kind of moving around doing stuff. All right. Any thoughts? You guys get the Galilean thing, right? Galilean thing. It'd be like a guy from Alabama. Be like be like a guy from Alabama hanging out in New York City, right? Or my buddy from Mississippi who came out here to Hawaii and heard a guy preaching in a very thick pidgin accent, and he only picked up about 60% of the words. Um, so it's that idea that this Galilean, this country bumpkin from up north, hanging out with the very cultured folks in Jerusalem would have stuck out like a sore thumb, quite frankly. Where'd you come from? All right, well, you guys got nothing, so let's talk about it. Why did he deny Jesus? What motivates him to deny Jesus at this point? And this maybe isn't a very hard question, but he
Sheer
does it.
fear.
Huh?
Absolute sheer fear.
What's he fearful of, Larry?
Well, Peter knew, the traditions of the Jews and of the Romans. He knew if basically if he had anything to do with Jesus and and Jesus was convicted, then he and the disciples would have to serve the same fate as Jesus did, whether it was stoning from the Jews or whether it was being crucified on the cross by the Romans. So he knew what was coming, and he knew that if Jesus was found guilty, that is the fate that was waiting for him. So he knew that he had to disassociate himself with Jesus and the disciples. So he just had to come clean and get away from it.
All right. So why the heck was he there in the first place then? Doesn't it seem like there's a little bit of a gear grinding going on here?
Well, yeah, like most things, you can talk a good story. You can go online here and type a good story. But when it comes right down to the point where you're facing the same thing that Jesus is facing, which he knew was going to be death, one way or the other, either by stoning and or by being crucified on the cross, your boldness disappears in a big hurry.
It's an amazing thing. He'd come there, and then when he gets questioned, he basically goes out on the front porch, the front portico. He was trying to find some shadows, some shade somewhere, and just be as inconspicuous as he humanly could, right? I mean, doesn't it feel kind of like a moth to the flame here a little bit?
Pretty much.
Yeah. I don't really think it's a dissociation piece for him. Like I kind of want to give him some credit. Like he's clearly sticking around. Like I would say he's lying on his feet to try to buy him some time because he's trying to figure out what to do. Not well thought out, but I don't think he's fully fearful of being found out and discovered because he just pulled a knife on a man who's serving the high priest. Like I'm willing to bet someone saw his face.
That has been conjectured. It's not certain, but there's a sense that
he's already taken strong action.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. So I don't think he's trying to dissociate. Like I would like to say he's just buying himself some time. He's more a man of action, not a man of thought.
So you're thinking if he can disassociate to a point, he can stick around long enough to see the end of the story,
or find a way to bail Jesus out,
bring Jesus or something like that.
I mean,
okay.
Pulled a knife once, might do it again once they come out of the courtroom.
Well, I mean, he's no zealot like Simon the Zealot, but he was one of the ones that was asking Jesus about the political revolution. And now Jesus is getting arrested for political revolution. He says, on the one hand, I can't get caught up in this now. Like if there's any hope at all, I can't also go get rounded up right now. Like, oh no, Jesus is going, but we got to do something to keep this rolling here. But also, he might not want to contribute, because think about it. They're doing all these show trials, and they can't get two witnesses to corroborate their testimony. Well, one conspirator isn't a conspiracy. Two conspirators is a conspiracy. So if he can avoid evidence of a movement going on here, then he's, maybe given Jesus a chance or whatever. So it's not necessarily just he's afraid and falling away, although there is plenty of indication of that later on, especially in John. But he's doing what he thinks is what Jesus would expect, and that's not what God ever expects out of us. God just wants the dedication. Let him worry about the consequences.
Yeah, see, I like the way that you guys are all heading with this thing. It's like at the end of the day, whatever your motivation, whatever it is, we can't deny the Lord publicly, right? I mean, that's where the damage is. Whatever your particular and John, I like the way you said it. He's more of a man of action than a man of thought. And I think that encapsulates what we see of Peter in the Gospels, right? I mean, he's so impetuous. He's just out there without ever thinking about what the ramifications of these things are going to be. Let me step out of a boat. Again, we should admire that in the same way we admire that he went into the courtyard, right? I mean, that's the same guy. There's some boldness to that. But then you realize, oh heck, I've stepped in too far. Now what do I do? And in this case, it wasn't Lord help me. It's like instead, it's I don't know him,
Mhm.
you know, which the net result is, regardless of what your method is, what your motivation is, he
Denying
just
God.
denied Jesus. He just denied knowing Jesus. Right?
And it's doing it his own way instead of trusting.
Right. Exactly.
So, Pastor Bruce, I like John's venture into the ring here, kind of with a strong support from Trent. But the argument against that particular position is that Jesus foretold this.
Yep, that's very true.
So had Jesus not identified the troubled pair, then we could speculate something other than what Larry's thrown out there. Because, whether he's a zealot or whether he's looking to not create a second testimony, all of that stuff is fair game, except that Jesus identified him and then Peter vehemently said, nope, 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 I never, never, ever will. And so Jesus calling him out sort of gives Larry more credence in terms of why did he do what he did.
Mhm. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
right. Yeah, not to make a giant battle over it, just with the thought of how often do we think we're doing it God's way, and then have it revealed to us that no, that wasn't the way God would have had it with anything in our lives. Peter may very well have been told, "Hey, you're going to deny me 3 times." He said, "No, that's not. I'm not going to do that." And then here he goes, not thinking this is what he meant by denying him, until the third verse recorded like, "Oh wait, maybe that's what he was talking about." So he may have gone in with the best of intentions and thinking he's doing it exactly right until the realization comes over him later.
Hey, Trent, I'm on board with that too, except one of the pieces of history about Peter is he's not necessarily the originator of great ideas.
That's fair.
Well, his motive for going and following Jesus was one thing, but his motive for denying Jesus, and that is the question, why did
Yes.
he deny Jesus? And I still stick with mine. It was because he was scared. He was afraid of what might happen to him and all the disciples, basically, if they were connected to Jesus.
And Larry, I'm pretty solid in your camp, but here's the one part, and it kind of contributes to what these other guys are saying. He
Mhm.
didn't know. He didn't know what was going to happen. We know because we're reading it in the gospel. At the point that this happens, Peter has a sense, perhaps, and maybe he remembers something Jesus said to him about that he was going to be given up to the Gentiles and beaten and flogged and die, or maybe he didn't. But in a sense, and the reason I bring this up is I think lots of times we tend to be fearful because we come up with what we think the end is going to be before we actually know what it's going to be. Now, to your point, yeah, they found him guilty and they sent him on to Pilate. But in all fairness, the next part we're going to see with Pilate is Pilate was kind of squarely on the fence about Jesus. It could have gone either way, except that obviously God's plan was to have him be crucified. But for anybody else, it could have gone either way with Pilate. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that while you're right about the fear, he may have been ramping up too much for himself, possibly. Of course, there's
Yeah.
always the sense that Trent used the word co-conspirator. I mean, he knew he'd been with Jesus the whole time, and he was enemy number one right now. So that does lead back to where you're at.
Yeah. I mean, right before this, the last little section made a pretty big demonstration that it was a show trial. It talks about them being on the porch. These aren't that mega buildings. This is the ancient world, so I'm pretty sure they would have had some idea of what proceedings were happening inside. And I said, "Oh well, this one's in the bag. They don't have anything on them. They can't get this to stick. I don't need to, throw gas on this fire. I'll throw gas on other fires. It's Peter who we're talking about, but maybe not this fire."
Somebody else coming in.
Yeah, can I lend some support to John's tagline of Peter that he's a man of action? Because I really like that the more I think about it, is when we take a look at Peter, impulsive Peter, with the exception of maybe one account, which is the Mount of Transfiguration, he almost makes better decisions in the moment than when he has a chance to think a little bit about it. So his blurting out, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God," his walking on the water, and his cutting off Malchus's ear, because that man of action, that really, those three events sort of bring that into focus, in that when Peter's in the moment, he's going to do the thing that he believes is best. Now, he doesn't get it right all the time, but there's definitely action, activity. He's not the silent guy who stays in the boat. But following along right now, he's got time. This is going to go back to Larry's camp. He's got time to be thinking about this. He doesn't know what's going to happen, but he's got time to let fear creep in, where when he took the sword out to take off Malchus's ear, he wasn't afraid at that point. He was working on impulse. Right now, he's got time to sit, kind of think, because he's creeping. He's creeping and he's following kind of clandestinely. And all of that sort of stuff sets you up to sort of be a little bit apprehensive about what's going to happen, not to necessarily everybody else, what's going to happen to me.
Yeah, I like that, and that's often where we get to, right? When we have time to percolate on things, as opposed to just go do what the Lord tells you to do. We can start to think about all the ramifications of where this might go. So yeah, I like that as well. So the net result is we have Peter denying Jesus 3 times, just like Jesus said he would do. And the cock crows and he weeps. And basically at this point, at least in Matthew, you never see Peter again till the end. So you figure he's failed Jesus, and now he's out of the picture for a little while. I asked this question, and it may seem just really weird, but I'm kind of trying to go at it from the standpoint of the writing of the gospel, as well as the what's the teaching that's behind it. That's why I asked the question the way I do. What literary and spiritual point does the timing of this denial present? And what I mean by the timing is we see how Mark is putting the show trial out there at the same time that he's got Peter denying Jesus. And so what's the point there? Why have I know they happen that way, but the way that it's written, that you've got the one and the other going on concurrently, what point do you think that the gospel is trying to make here? Beyond what we just said.
Accountability for infidelity, because Jesus already called him out on it. And he knew he was going to hold him to it as part of like denial and betrayal. And
I think that's. Oh, keep going. I'm sorry.
And because he wept, and NIV says he broke down and wept. It's like it's a convicting thing, like God holding you accountable for infidelity and in your support. Like he's going to take his toll on it.
Okay. I think that's all totally right. Though I think that's only part of why, part of the answer to why it's where it is. That accountability is very important. And I think that actually maybe is an overarching idea, even beyond just Peter.
Well, we as humans, I really don't think that we have a real concept of God's timeline. We're always impatient. We always want it done now. We want to see the results. We want to see it, whether it's our ego or just the need to see whatever it is finished. We just don't have a concept. But God's timing it's always perfect. It's never early. It's never late. It's always perfect, and it always how would I say this? It always fulfills its mission or its purpose, for whatever it was meant to perform in all actuality. And it really doesn't matter the circumstance. Yes, Peter did deny Christ 3 times, and he realized that he had failed God because he had heard the rooster, crow the 3rd time. So, yeah, so that's what I got out of that whole thing. So,
okay, I think, yeah, I see Preston saying the simultaneous nature shows us that Jesus knows it all. That kind of goes along with what you're saying there, Larry. This idea that Jesus understood the timing. Peter did not understand the timing.
right.
And go ahead.
When you say literary here in this question, do you mean like Chekhov's gun in theory? Like if there's a gun on the stage in the first act, it has to go off by the end of the 3rd act?
Yeah,
Like,
I don't think.
But with the idea of, hey, Mark put it in the gospel for a reason, that Jesus predicted this. And he also talked about just prior to this being ready whatever time of the night in the first watch, the middle watch, and the cock crows. He's saying, look, we just talked about this, and then here it happened. Or you think like a hero's journey, a Joseph Campbell kind of thing, where it's right at Jesus' greatest hour of need, that's when he's most abandoned and all that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be that high-minded as far as the literary part. Just more from the perspective of, I like Chekhov's gun. That's cool. Just from a standpoint of why it is written the way it is, the structure of this. I'll go ahead and cheat it a little bit. You got intercalation here. You got some intercalation going on. And so we know intercalation usually is there to emphasize a point. And so less about, yeah, certainly there's the prophecy and the fulfillment, but that to me almost would be more spiritual than literary. So it's not about that, but this intercalation idea is trying to emphasize a very important point. You guys are kind of pecking on it pretty hard, but I think there's there's kind of an A and a B to it, if you will. And you guys, Larry, you're really hitting up against it when you talked about God's timing and Jesus being perfect, and Preston saying he got it. Let me kind of push it a little harder. There's a tension here in this passage, if you will. What's the tension? But what between what? You guys are right on it. Peter's denial, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would the tension against that be? Which we actually saw last week. And we'd see this week and next week and the week after that.
Jesus' obedience.
Boom. Right there, right? And the moment where Jesus is being obedient to the Father to give himself to the Gentile, well, not the Gentiles, that's later this lesson, but the very moment that Jesus has surrendered himself, right, to begin the process that would put him on the cross, we have Peter denying him, right? So you have the absolute 100% unabated obedience of Jesus Christ, right, juxtaposed against Peter, huh? What was that?
Well, it's in the sense that there's kind of a theme through the Bible of the test. You know,
Yeah.
you choose between the tree of life or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There's a test to that is a matter of devotion to God. And every single, story of the Old Testament all the way through into the New Testament is a juxtaposition of there's choosing God's way and then there's choosing the human way. And
Sure.
sin is the choosing the human way. It's the rebellion over and over. And here we just have that final at the maximum point of suffering.
Yep.
Jesus not as a moral influence, but Jesus is, look, this is God's way. This is what it looks like when a human does it God's way.
Yeah.
And Peter is the strange ultimate example of rejection.
A guy who said, "I'll go to the death for you." I mean, a lot of the people that, to your point, fail the test have not pronounced in front of their peers, "Not me. These guys might, but not me." That's pretty rough. Now, there's a part B you got to kind of grab onto now as well, and this is a little more in the realm of maybe scholarly conjecture, but I think you can kind of follow up on it. You got to remember that Mark's writing most likely to Roman believers in a time where persecution is starting to elevate, and so there's this idea that's afoot that Peter is using this to a certain extent that Mark is using this to a certain extent as a caution to the Christians in Rome that they needed to be spiritually prepared for persecution. They couldn't go in there kind of, all right, here you go, John, half cocked, like Peter, right? You can think you got it all figured out. You can think I'm going to do it, but the truth is, as a loyal follower of Christ as Peter, when chips were down, ended up recanting essentially his fellowship of Jesus. Whatever his motivation was, he recanted. And so, there's a sense that Mark is presenting this absolutely as the obedience of Christ and the rejection of Peter, but also to say it could happen to you too.
Yeah.
And not just the Romans in the first century, but guess what? Americans in the 21st century as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter failed him, but yet Jesus still used him.
Oh yeah. Well, he had to restore him first to let him know that, you're still okay. You're still in my team. And by the way, you got work to do. It's not like you're forgiven and you can just go home and fish. Right? Thoughts on that?
Like it.
Well, good. I'm glad. Anything to add?
I think you guys kind of chock full loaded that bad boy. I think we haven't seen Peter restored just yet, but I think you're being very, very erudite when you're using the literary mechanism here, because Peter's rejection is not exactly like Adam and Eve's. His motivation is a little bit different, but I can rest with you there. But the absolute obedience and then the 180 degrees in the other direction, certainly there's good sensibility there watching these two at work. And if I was going to add anything of real value besides just riffing here, I'd say counting the cost.
Okay.
Counting the cost is one of the elements here. If indeed we're having Peter prepare John Mark prepare the Roman audience for what that might look like.
And Preston, that's a I don't know that we all have always recognized the power of that phrase, count the cost. And Jesus himself uses it. Um, it's so easy to tell somebody, well, accept Jesus and, follow him and so forth and so on. But, Jesus himself spends a fair amount of time talking about the fact, if you follow me, trouble's coming. Be ready. You could lose your family, you could lose your life, and everything in between. And so I know very few people who are evangelistic in mind. I'm talking about like maybe gifted with evangelism that spend much time talking about the fact. Now, if you accept Jesus, get ready. I think there's such an indication that you want to get them saved and hallelujah and get them in my church and get them in my Bible study. And I don't want to scare them off. We'll save that for later. Maybe it never comes up.
So you know my philosophy about that, Pastor, which is you need to give people their job description and responsibilities when they get hired. Because if you wait to tell them after they've been in position for a while, that will make them look for other jobs. That will make them afraid that they're not up for the task because you're incrementally exposing them to what their duties and responsibilities might be as opposed to giving it all to them when they walk in the door. And that's a disservice that we regularly do to believers, is that we don't let them know that they are marked. There's a target on their back. And when we take a look at this, the way that you've helped to lay out tonight, Peter's going to be able to reflect later, but not necessarily right now. This is the valley of the shadow of death for him at this point in time. He knows what David gets credit for having written, yet he can't use that right now because he's so detached from that, because his fear doesn't allow him to access what his faith later on will kind of plug in automatically. And we're talking after Acts chapter 2.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. After that, after the Spirit comes, after Jesus is resurrected and they receive the Holy Spirit, that's a whole different Peter at that point. But it's interesting too. And as you were talking through that, you just know, we talked last week about the fact that the Sanhedrin realized that Jesus being captured and under arrest and now being tried by them, to their minds, negated any messianic claim he may have. And because these guys still didn't get it, even at this point, you got to think, and this kind of goes to where John's point was, I'm going to rescue him. We're going to get this kingdom going again. It's like you have a crisis for him too, possibly as well, to a certain extent. So,
I mean, it is kind of a preview for us in our time too, that Peter kind of fell into this triumphalist attitude. I'm already on the team. I'm all set. It's great. I mean, we talked about it with counting the cost, but we see that a lot on kind of the evangelical side of our country and our culture is, it's not just the prosperity stuff that I bag on too much, but just the general idea that being on the right team makes you a winner and makes you a champion, makes you all this and that. That doesn't stand up when the other team gets a vote.
Right.
Everybody's got a plan till they get hit in the mouth, as they used to say, and here's Peter getting his plan hit in the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't stand up to it. I mean, this should be a good lesson for us today to realize, look, there's a lot more to the Bible than just winning.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where a lot of Christians have their crisis, whether it's they're a candidate and doesn't get elected, or they're, every effort they made blew up in their face, or, they're whatever. They don't have the happy, sorry, Christine, they don't have their happy Hallmark ending. And it's like, wait a minute, I belong to Jesus. There's a guy on TV that said something about I was going to have the best life ever. How'd this happen?
And it's so much of the Old Testament scripture. I mean, what, 40% of the Psalms are laments, and the whole book of Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Job. It's all about, man, I'm on God's team and this isn't working. I don't get it. But they always end with, but I still trust God. And it's going to work out. somehow, and that's what Peter dropped out.
That's it. I mean, and you wonder as you said that, I've wondered this, and I've certainly posited about it at times is what if over the last 200 years our hymnals, our modern hymnals reflected the mix of the Psalms? What if our modern praise choruses, what if one or two of our praise choruses every week were laments? I mean, I can name two or three modern songs, and we don't ever sing them. And so we do expect to a large extent that everything's going to work out. I mean, that's what Romans 8:28 tells us, right? I'm sorry. I'm poking. I was poking on Sunday and I'm still poking tonight. I'm sorry. Just
I'll say that the lament thing was on my mind because it's something that's gone on at school. So
okay.
it had an impact mostly because of not having an impact before.
Right.
So you got a lot of catching up to do to really absorb that kind of stuff. So I'm still chewing on it.
All right. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. That makes me happy. We need to talk about your seminary sometimes. You're in there a little, you've been in there a while, so I got to get some feedback from you offline about that. Yeah, so thank you, Preston, for stirring the pot on the whole counting the cost idea. We need to talk about that a whole lot more. But we'll have to do that maybe after the first of the year. We can get in a Bible study about that. That might be a good thing to talk about.
I'm just thinking about Peter and his frailty at this moment where he's just a big ball of nerves and fear and adrenaline and everything else. And it's like this is the time that if God, in the form of Jesus, were to look to man for support, it's not there. God knows we are but dust. He knows that even with our best intentions, we need him.
Yep. Yeah, I like those words you just said there, Paula, with our best intentions. I think we can be really hypercritical about people sometimes, and in a moment of judgmentalism, we'll say, "Oh man, he was nothing. He never intended to do it at all." And I've long believed that, people really do have good intentions oftentimes, but the execution is woefully short of that
I hear it's
intent.
a good paving material.
It's what?
I hear it's a good paving material.
What is good intentions? Indeed, indeed. But yeah, well said as far as, not that Jesus needed Peter. He knew he's going to drop the ball. He knew it. He'd already
Right.
planned it, right? But still, you'd like to think he could have stood in there, but he didn't. Well said. All right, well, let's look at Pilate for a little bit. Pontius Pilate. I realize I didn't write the name Pontius anywhere in here, but it's Pontius Pilate. Um, I before I dive into this, last week I spent some time kind of breaking down in the four Gospels how the different writers of the Gospels managed the interaction between Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate and Herod. And so, having that I did that last week, I'm really not going to spend much time in that this week, unless you have specific questions about that, and really more just focus on what Mark has to say, and unless there's a good reason. There are a couple in the notes even. So, but doing less compare and contrast of all of that legal stuff. Let me read these 15 verses, though, starting off Mark 15. There we read this. Immediately in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you?" But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he has always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, "What then do you want me to do with this whom you call the king of the Jews?" So they cried out again, "Crucify him." Then Pilate said to them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus, after he had scourged him, to be crucified. Preston, I got you on here twice now. You're like kind of trying to surround us. It's like the Matrix or something. So,
Technical difficulties. I'm working through them.
all right. You're not wearing dark sunglasses and a dark suit right now or anything, are you? Just want to make sure.
I'm not, mister. I'm not gonna. I was gonna do a Matrix thing. I'm not doing it.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I digress. So let's see if we can. There's a lot here. There could be a whole lot more. I'm just going to kind of hit high points unless you guys ask some stuff here, but we're just going to kind of try to drill down this one a little bit. Number one, the Romans could have cared less about blaspheming God. That was not a crime to them. That wasn't even of an interest to them. And so the Sanhedrin knew they couldn't come to Pilate's court and say to him, "We found this man guilty of blasphemy," because he'd say, "Get out of here." And so they couldn't do that, of course, with an Italian accent, but nonetheless. And so what they do, as you see here in verse 1 of chapter 15, they've gone through the trial, and now it's the morning. And Pilate, I think I've got it in here. No, maybe not. Oh, yeah, it does. It was normal procedure that essentially the Roman government leaders and the government in general would really get started early in the day, like perhaps even before daybreak. They were at work. And so if the Sanhedrin wanted to bring Jesus before Pilate, they had to be there super early. If they showed up at 9 o'clock, he was done for the day and he was back at home chilling out. So he had to get it done early. So that was the reasoning here that, as soon as they could, they had to get Jesus in front of Pilate. But they also had to hold this consultation because they had to come up with something that would be a legally binding crime that they could bring, a crime that would be considered a capital crime if they were going to get rid of Jesus. Preston's share. Oh, okay. That they would have to come up with that and get it in a form that they could bring it to Pilate so that he could review it at the beginning of the day. So there was a real movement that was going on there, an urgency on their part. Okay, so just to know the legal wranglings that are going on, and so, but Pilate, because he was the guy, he was the legate, he was the prefect, if you will, the Roman representative here. He had the authority that he could, once the charge was brought before him, he could say, just like our current judges can do, he could say, "Okay, I confirm this charge," and say judgment be passed. Or he could say, "Nope, I don't see it. There's no evidence to this point. I overturn this." In essence, he'd be almost like an appeals court. And so in order for him to do that, he would have to acquaint himself with the charges. And so they would have to bring those charges. It'd be a very formal charge. And then some representative from the Sanhedrin would bring the charges forth and present them. And then the defendant, in this case is Jesus, would have the right to defend himself. I mean, we know Roman courts, they were very organized. The Greek courts had been before that, the Roman courts. And so there was a legal proceeding that was going on here. And so as we read this, and it's highly in all four gospels and in its highly condensed form, that's what the writers are trying to present to us is a legal Roman proceeding before the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, who was in Jerusalem. He had always, apparently it was this practice, because you guys know, right, when they had the feast, especially Passover, Jerusalem just multiplied, and there was a lot going on. And you got to think about this, that since about 6 AD, that there had been, just this roiling and increasing intensity of rebellion among the Jews as far as the Romans. They were unhappy with the Romans being there, and of course that was going to hit its apex in 70, well, in the years leading up to 70 AD, but 70 AD was where they're going to be crushed. Aside from this, just for a second, when we were in Rome, right across the street from the Colosseum is Titus's Arch, and it's an art, our victory arch in Rome, and it is commemorating Titus's defeat of the Jews in Jerusalem. And I mean, it's cool. There's all kinds of reliefs on the side of this arch, or that are reminiscent of the battle and of the Jewish culture. And so I took a bunch of pictures of that. And Titus would ultimately become the emperor. So, but at the point that he did that, he was a general. So, am I right? His father was the emperor at that time.
Father Vespasian. Yeah.
Vespasian, yeah. And so, anyway, just so I said that out loud. So there was, I talked a couple of weeks ago about the intrigue. You've got the intrigue that's going on religiously that's going on here, but then you've got all the political intrigue that's going on as well. And so that's going to feed into how Pilate deals with this interaction with Jesus. And many feel like, and again, God's plan, but feel like Pilate kind of fumbled the ball in this. He probably underestimated the strain that was going on in the Jewish culture at the time, and probably overestimated his own diplomatic skills, quite frankly. But just, you have to know that what lies behind that is Pilate didn't like the Jewish people. He probably more or less hated the Jewish people. He didn't like all their gyrations. He didn't like all their religious fervor. He didn't like the fact that they were anti-Roman. And so he didn't have a lot of respect for them. We could even say disdain for the Jewish people. So, and he was fairly cruel. And so you're dealing with a guy who didn't have much to say good about these people or what was going on here. Again, why they weren't going to bring some religious charge, because he would have just kicked him out if he didn't beat him. So, so he would come to the Jewish feasts he would come to Jerusalem during the feast, and it's believed that he would stay at Herod's palace, which, if you guys know, and I said I'd mentioned it a couple of times, it went when I believe it was Luke, when he was investigating and he found out that it was in Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod. Well, they might have been in the same building, actually. And so it wasn't too hard to shuttle him over and then back. And they became friends after that, right? So that was kind of the sense. But he wanted to have an eye on Jerusalem during the feast days, because if something was going to blow up politically, that was going to be the time. And so Pilate wanted to be essentially at ground zero in Judea during those periods of time. That was that's why he was there. That's why he was there. And so again, God knew all that. God used all of that. God might have put that in his heart to start with, so he'd be in Jerusalem every year. I mean, you got to think about that, guys. And I don't want to beat on that drum too hard, but God makes sure his plan gets accomplished. I mean, the zeal of the Lord is going to accomplish this. Don't ever miss that. It's been said that there's a certain irony to it that Jesus had very pointedly rejected being a political Messiah, and yet at the point that he has charges brought against him to Pilate, it's said that he is a political Messiah, and so the very thing that he didn't do, and so you wonder why they couldn't find people to testify. I mean, he wasn't doing that. Mark makes the point that they made many charges against him, and this is one of the couple of times where I think it's important that we look at one of the other gospels. Luke gives some detail to that. In Luke chapter 23, verse 2, it says, they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, you guys, they, perverting the nation, you can see where what Jesus has taught could be twisted to meet these criteria, right? I mean, you've heard it said, but I say, right? That's kind of more of a Matthew thing, but Jesus had plenty of that. Forbidding to pay taxes, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar and God what is God's, right? You kind of heard that before. And calling himself the Christ, a king, that's less, it's less obvious in the Gospels. But he had said to the chief priest, right? He kind of gone through that last week, and we talked about that. So they're taking what Jesus has said out of context in many cases, perverting it, and then bringing it forward to Pontius Pilate. So that's kind of what's going on here again. But they've got to build a case that Jesus is guilty of sedition, that he's guilty of treason, high treason. They've got to bring something that's going to get Jesus sentenced to death. They've got to do that. So, and again, I was doing the research. We talked about this last week. They typically they could pronounce a death sentence, but they couldn't carry it out. So they had to depend. I mean, this is death by Roman is essentially what we're talking about, right? I mean, that's essentially, they couldn't do it themselves. They had to use the Romans to get this done. And so that's why it says in verse 10, it says that Pilate knew the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. This guy, this is not this guy's. He's been in this position since 26 AD. So if this is 30 AD, which is kind of where we think it is, he's been on the job for 4 years. He has seen all kinds of things, and Pilate kind of comes off sometimes as being kind of this bumbler, but the man was efficient at his job. He stayed at it for another 6 years after this. Okay, they weren't doing a good job. He didn't have enough friends in high places that he could have stayed on the job if he was incompetent, I don't think. And you guys can give me commentary on that all you want when we get to that point. But there's a sense that he knew by just watching this continuation of the kangaroo court from the night before that the Sanhedrin were bringing trumped up charges against Jesus, and they're just trying to make something stick. And he could tell that it was basically just a ruse on their part to try to get him to find Jesus guilty so he could off them. They didn't like him. They didn't want him around. So that's where we are with that. And so when he starts trying to let Jesus go, it's many believe that it's because he didn't like the Sanhedrin, he didn't like them and all their gyrations, and he's basically kind of trying to punch them in the mouth. And show disrespect to them. And this is a way this is what they want. That's the last thing I'm going to give them, is the idea there. He's being obstinate to the Jewish leaders. And so it's not that he's got some great inner turmoil about this thing. This is some no-name Jewish guy, rabbi, that these people are brought forward to try to destroy. And so, I think we invest a lot more into Pilate maybe than we should on this. It's not like he had some idea that Jesus was the Messiah. He didn't care. It's an internal Jewish matter, and he's just gotten kind of caught up in it for what it's worth. And so they've got this guy Barabbas, and that guy's there's some commentary about this, and I'm not going to burn a lot of time on it tonight. His name means son of the father. And there's been a lot of conjecture about the fact that perhaps his father actually had been a rabbi. There's a whole lot written about Barabbas, but we know from the text basically that, and we go back to Trent, what you were talking about last week about the robbers and all that sort of thing. These guys were murderers. They were insurrectionists. They were rebels. And it's been said that possibly the two guys that were crucified on either side of Jesus were actually the ones that weren't fortunate enough to get released by Pilate. They were his buddies. And so imagine that, they know they're get crucified, and it's like they go up and then Jesus, who are you? Where's Barabbas? What happened with that? But I guess they probably knew when he got pulled out of the cell. He's like, yeah, see you guys. I'll keep the battle going. And, for what it's worth. But, that kind of adds a neat layer to it if you think about the fact that, Barabbas should have been the guy in the middle, not Jesus. And instead, his pals, get this Galilean rabbi. Of course, the beauty is if the Barabbas had been in the middle, the guy to the left, yeah, he wouldn't have been in paradise. So you got to think about that too. So just one last thought. It talks here at the end of the passage about the fact that Pilate had Jesus scourged, and if you guys have seen pictures of the Roman flagellum, and if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, that even isn't even near as gruesome as the real act. Those flagella that had those leather strips on them that had bone and metal at the end, those things were designed to literally not just tear your skin, they were designed to rip your flesh off, to the point that often people, by the time they were finished being scourged, and the Romans weren't like the Jews. The Jews had this, 39 lashes thing, or 39 and 1. The Romans didn't have a limit. They could do it as long as they wanted to, and it was basically just dictated by the cruelty of the Roman whipmaster. And so, they would literally leave it to the point that your organs and bones were showing. And so many times people who were being scourged, they died from the scourging. So you didn't have to even get to that point. And so, we know that when the Lord went to the cross, he was severely weakened after the sleepless night, the sweating the great drops of blood, and then suffering at the hands of the Romans as he was whipped, probably to within, a few inches of his life, and then taken to the cross. It was about as cruel as it possibly could be. So I'm going to pause there. I've got a couple of questions, but comments or questions from you guys about all of that. All right. I'll ask you the easy question first. So why would they choose Barabbas over Jesus? And you don't get to say, because that was what the Lord's plan was. I know that. All right. The Lord was orchestrating this. I get it. But why choose Barabbas, a murderer and a revolutionary, over Jesus?
They like the idea of revolutionary.
It seems like it, doesn't it, John?
Yeah.
Okay. So they like the revolutionary. You mean he's more popular than Jesus? Is that what we're saying?
In the moment, yeah, since the priest stirred him up.
Yeah. Take that last little piece. Is there something to that?
Yeah, I think the Passion of the Christ did a pretty good job of demonstrating that, or at least emphasizing the priest kind of wandering around the crowd and getting the chant going. What we call the wisdom of the crowd.
Yeah, yeah. That's an ironic phrase. The wisdom of the crowd. Yeah, not seeing that a whole lot. We were having a conversation with somebody the other night about the fact that, when they started tearing down statues a couple of years ago, that they, tear down statues of Ulysses Grant. It's like he wasn't the right guy to tear down. Sorry, or a lot of other people.
And also, everyone that had grabbed Jesus to begin with was there in the crowd, and so their voices were a lot louder than the rest of them that were there. They had a big contingent there to help stir up the crowd to say, "Crucify him," like Trent was saying.
Yeah, can't you imagine that when they knew they were going to Pilate, they just come on, guys, we need you out there.
And
We need you out there. There's a sense that some people believe that they were there that day to appeal for Barabbas's release, but that just got supercharged when you had the enemies of Christ there.
Is there a reason why Barabbas was chosen as the alternate and not any of the other two? Since it seems like they were all there at the same time for the same thing.
Well, I
Beast.
don't know of anything. I mean, he's not really known to us from history. As a matter of fact, the rebellion that he led is not really known to history, except that there were just a lot of those going on in the same way there seemed to be a lot of messiahs popping up in those days. And so the only thing I have to offer is that he must have been the most well known or the most, charismatic, or had a magnetic personality, or
Their own Che Guevara.
yeah, their own exactly, and that may be why sometimes they had conjectured that maybe he's the son of a rabbi, and we love his dad, so whatever. That's all conjecture again.
With all of this, you could also think that, we mentioned earlier, Jesus getting arrested served to invalidate his claim to messiahship to the
Yep.
Sanhedrin. You got to think that attitude would be pretty prevalent also. These people were like, man, this guy seemed so exciting just a couple of days ago, and now look at him.
Can't you almost hear in the crowd, we really thought this guy was something. We really thought he was something. He hadn't done jack for us. At least this Barabbas guy is trying to get the Romans out of here.
At least he gets results.
Yeah. Too bad he got caught, but you know what? Maybe we can get him out and get him going again. And I mean, guys, I hope you understand. I'm none of my own feelings here. I'm just trying to kind of play act it a little bit as to what the crowd members may be saying. They didn't know who Jesus was. They wanted him to be, honestly, they wanted him to be Barabbas to a large extent. That's a messed up thought, isn't it? I have this thread in my mind that I keep kind of going back to, and I won't get into all the machinations that the Lord's kind of sent me through, but I think that it's very clear that in human culture, Jesus was the greatest servant of all time, period, by a large stretch, obviously. And it just goes to show that people will tend to gravitate to somebody they like more than they will gravitate to somebody who serves them. I think we see that in politics a lot. It's not the guy or the woman who does the great job lots of times, who's got the quality, who has dedicated themselves honestly to years and years of service. It's the guy with the best haircut or the best smile or the best rap. And people are kind of simple like that lots of times. Other thoughts on Barabbas? Don't need to beat it up. Just asking.
Well, you get that perverse incentive that you kind of feeds what you were just saying with politicians, but I mean, looking for short-term results too. You know, they had heard Jesus preaching, and it's a lot of like, man, that sounds great, and I appreciate getting rid of the leprosy, but you know, we could have the revolution right now.
Yeah, right. I mean,
You know, and just
what have you done for me lately, right?
or yeah, but another kind of way to think about sin that I've heard about is just to think of it as a shortcut.
Yeah.
Just like we say, good intentions and all that stuff, but you know, for the most part, all of the good thing, you know, all the things that Satan tempted Jesus with were technically good things. They were all things he was supposed to get anyway. You know, the thing that the serpent tempted Adam and Eve with is a good thing. Like it's an ideal. Like it'd be wonderful if it would just work out. But if you try to take a shortcut instead of doing it God's way, then that's when it becomes rebellious and sinful. So, you know, hey, let's choose Barabbas because we can get it now instead of waiting for whatever this nice guy stuff is.
Want it now. Yeah. And the thing is, so yeah, you go for the guy that's going to give you political freedom, that's going to give you, you know, freedom for the Romans, as opposed to the one who actually can give you true freedom. And it's a false or a pale comparison to those things. So, but there's sin for you. Well, so why would Pilate allow a man he believes is innocent to be crucified?
Yeah, like you said, he prized efficiency, and he's working with the people he doesn't necessarily like. Basically, a politician in an election year, just kind of saying stuff, just to make sure that he gets good favor from his bosses. They're like, "Yeah, my stuff's going great. My people, they stay in line."
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely had, you know, there's no doubt that if you were a Roman official anytime in the Roman Empire, but certainly even more so as it got later and later in the empire, yeah, political expediency became very important because it wasn't like you just got voted out. Sometimes it went a lot further than that.
Wasn't Pilate already in trouble anyway, or sort of in trouble because he had did some things that had infuriated the Jews in the past, and they had an uprising or an upheaval or whatever you want to call it, and the Jews were actually intimidating and threatening him with the loss of his position or power, because they were going to riot if he let Jesus go.
Well, I mean, in the immediate sense, if there's a guy that's saying that he's the king,
Yeah.
okay, just start with that. You don't have to even worry about whatever his past was. If there's a guy saying he was king, there was only one king in Rome, in the Roman
Right.
Empire.
Exactly.
Which was who? Which was who? Who was the king?
Tiberius, wasn't it?
Huh?
Was it Tiberius?
Yeah, well, it was the Caesar, right? I mean, it was
Yeah.
Caesar. Caesar.
Yeah,
And not
true.
only was he king, he was God to
Yeah.
them,
Right.
right? When we were in Italy, they were talking about it. You know, the idea was one way to keep the people in line was to have the same God, right? Because now you don't have a bunch of different stuff flailing out everywhere. You got one God, one-stop shop, and if the Caesar's king and God makes it real simple. Keep everybody in line, right? And
I
so,
got a question for you.
yep.
Now, couldn't the Jews have actually stoned him because he blasphemed God, said that he was the Son of God?
Well, we talked about that a little bit last week. In my further reading,
They put him to death.
they really weren't supposed to. They weren't supposed to do that. The Romans reserved what is referred to as the power of the sword. They wanted to be the ones who did that. Capital punishment was their purview. Um, and so it seems like that would have been that might have gotten the Jewish leaders in
That's
hot
what they
water.
were trying to get him on.
What?
That would be the only thing that they could get him on, that they could kill him for.
But I'm saying they weren't really.
For blaspheming God, because Leviticus 24:16 tells us that anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death.
Right. Well, I mean, if you're going to go with the law, there's a whole lot of things you could be stoned for. Infidelity, right? I mean, cheating on your wife, right? I mean, that was a stoning.
But that
Read
would
the
have
Old
been one
Testament on
of
that.
the death sentences for the Jewish people by their law.
Yeah, it would. There was a whole lot more than just blasphemy. The Jews could have stoned
Oh
somebody.
yeah, I understand.
But again, the Romans wanted to have that power. They wanted to have the power of the sword to take a life. And so, even though that's why all they could do is the Jewish leaders could pronounce a death sentence, but then it was going to be up to the Romans to fulfill it. But the Romans weren't going to crucify Jesus for blasphemy because they didn't care.
Exactly.
They didn't care at all. Now,
why they got him on the king thing.
Well, yeah, because now he's usurping the kingship, right? I mean, he's there, and so now where Pilate's, and this is kind of where your first question came from, for Pilate not to deal with the fact that this man was guilty of insurrection, the treacherous part for him was if he didn't deal with it, there was always a chance that there could be some kind of an appeal up the ladder, right, up the structure. Right. And the last thing that Pilate wants to do is be accused of not quelling an insurrection by the Jews, who were known to be a hot pocket of rebellion in the Roman Empire. Right. And so that's where you would have had that issue. Right. We see that actually in one of the other Gospels a little bit more, where there's that kind of tinge of the idea of threat that, well, if you don't do it, then what's that say about you?
Yeah.
Now remember, Pilate's wife was telling him, and again, I think this is over in Luke, where she said she'd had a dream. Am I right about that? Is it Luke?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, where she'd had a dream about it and said, you need to stay away from this. Just stay away from this. This is bad news, right? And so, yeah, there's definitely a threat there to him. In some ways, he's got to toe the line. The last thing you want to do is have somebody appeal up the ladder of authority.
Yeah,
so there's certainly some aspect of that.
Wasn't that the reason he washed his hands and said, "I have nothing to do with this. This is on you," kind of a thing, basically?
Not necessarily. I mean, he. That's over in John. It's not necessarily that he was doing that from the standpoint of I'm washing my hands, so that gets me off the hook. At least I don't see it that way, politically speaking.
Yeah, I think even more immediately here, you see it more so in Luke is not just he's wanting to satisfy the crowd, as their shouts prevailed in Luke's telling. So like, he has tried over and over to say, look, there's nothing here.
Yeah,
I'm going to just punish him and let him go. Yeah. So not just, oh, I don't want to be seen as being soft on crime. It's he's about to have an insurrection if he doesn't stop an insurrectionist.
Exactly.
Now, here's where that comes in, and you should
hardly let the crowd just run away on him.
Right, because now he's got a rebellion. It's kind of like what happened in Philippi? Not Philippi. Where they have the riot with Jason? Where was that? Ephesus? Ephesus? Wherever that was in Acts, right? I mean, when things got out of control, they came in and said, "Wait a minute, guys, we can't be doing this." Ephesus. We can't do this. This is going to look bad for us with the Roman government, right? That's that same kind of thing. And here's what when I said earlier, Pilate fumbled. Here's where he fumbled in one way. He thought there seems to be a sense here that he thought that the people would side with him and let Jesus go. But why would they side with Pilate? I mean, politically, he should know that they're not going to side with him against the Pharisees and Sadducees. I mean, where's their loyalty, right? And understand. I mean, in a neutral situation, not this, where there was an expectation that he was going to release a prisoner every year, right? So now the door's kind of open for a sense of a slight sense of democracy, if you will, because he's trying to do a favor for the Jews. In any given situation, they're going to have to side with Pilate because he's the leader. But the door is open here slightly for them to have a voice. And so, given that, they're going to side with their guys. They're going to side with the Sanhedrin. They got to deal with the Sanhedrin. They don't deal with Pilate. They deal with the Sanhedrin all the time. And so Pilate, I think, had this political thought that, well, if I say, I say I'm going to give you Jesus, they're just going to be thankful and they'll take it. But when you've got these people that have got the crowd whipped up, they went with them. They went with them instead of with Pilate. He made a huge political miscalculation there, that he somehow was going to be able to manipulate this circumstance the way that it needed to go. He just was. And instead, the people said, we want the one that the priest and the Sadducees and the elders are yelling for. We want that one. And so he kind of got caught between a rock and a hard place there. And so, Larry, to your point, then he says, fine, you want it? You got it. I didn't find anything. There's nothing this guy did. There's nothing this Jesus did that's worthy of execution. He's done nothing wrong. But instead of allowing justice to carry the day, what did he look at? Same thing Peter did. He's looking out for himself. Isn't that amazing? Two very different men, but motivated by basically the same thing. Other thoughts on that?
I can't imagine what, just Pilate having to come to terms with this, because as you said, he had to educate himself on the situation to give fair judgment. So I'm sure he had to learn who Jesus was, and the Romans are, had their own pantheon, so I'm sure they were well into mysticism. They hear this guy that cures leprosy, cures death, and feeds thousands of people out of nothing. It's like, you want to kill him?
When you think about that, it really brings into relief the point that it's over in John's gospel where what does Pilate ask Jesus? What is truth? And it kind of adds a certain level of poignancy to that question. When he basically, knows the truth and yet chooses not to follow it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pilate pretty much knew that they were bringing Jesus up there on trumped up charges to begin with.
That's what I said earlier.
Nothing that really stuck for a death sentence, at least by the Romans.
No, that's the whole point. Is that nothing that Pilate could do was going to change the fact that Jesus was innocent of all charges.
Right, and he tried to turn him over and say, "Look, you've done nothing. This is bull," but it didn't work.
Exactly. It didn't work. But, you know, uh, like in John's Gospel in verse 38 of chapter 18, it says, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and he said to them, "I find no fault in him at all."
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you know, and that's been quizzed a lot, but here he is. He knows that Jesus is innocent. And yet the truth of that doesn't change the fact that the people, his own people, want to destroy him. What sense does that make? What sense does that make? And so, I just wonder, and this is Bruce way out on a limb for a second. He knows the Jewish people have a code of conduct that's way, way higher than the Romans. He's got to by now. They've got this supposed, holy God, and they've got the temple and their worship, and maybe he sees it the same as the Romans, but I just have a sense that they've been trying to tell him or show him for 4 years that their system is superior to his, and for all their superiority, at the end of the day, they're trying to murder an innocent man.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, see, your system is just as corrupt as ours is. Matter of fact, maybe more so. We wouldn't, and I know this is not true either. We wouldn't kill an innocent man. I mean, certainly you would if politics required it.
Didn't he say who commits the greater sin is he who turned me over to you, or something similar to that?
I don't know. I'd have to go look at that. I don't know if I know that phrase. But the fact is, he's got a disdain for him, and his disdain is being backed up.
Mhm.
It really is. So, the thought there. So at the end of the day, I think that's the interesting thing, is that it came down to the very simple point that he turned Jesus over because it was politically expedient for him. It came down to that. It's my neck or his.
Yeah.
Right. So that at that point, now we're going to see this next step, which is now the scourging has taken place, and now the Lord is going to the cross, because the Jewish leaders needed him gone, because in the same way it was politically expedient for them. He was in the way of them getting what they wanted, and the Romans were the same way. Just it was politically expedient to get rid of the one that was causing all the problem.
Mhm.
Certainly God's plan.
The
But
system was corrupt, as it is today.
none seek him, no, not one. I mean, the only reason that we have what we have in the church is because of the Holy Spirit, God's saving power and his Spirit in our midst. Left to our own devices, we'd be as corrupt as they are. Maybe not in the same form or the same scope, but we'd be just as corrupt.
No doubt.
And so I think it's always important that we remember that we're Pilate. We're the Sanhedrin. It's only through the blood of Christ that we're different from them. So it's easy to get really down on these cats, but the bottom line is that they're us. So praise you, Jesus, for your
Amen.
saving blood.
Just a sinner saved by grace.
Yeah. But now we're royal priesthood, so we get to take that and go
Amen.
with it.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all I got for tonight. Anything from you, ladies and gents? All right. Well, thanks for hanging with me, guys. You guys are entertaining tonight, and helpful and informative, and so it's made it easier to stay up till dark 30. So that's very good. I appreciate that. Next week we're going to continue on with the narrative. I know we'll start there in 16. I forget exactly where we're going, how far we're going next. Hang on. We're going to go 16 through 32. 16 through 32. Mark 15, 16 through 32. So we're going to be really 2 weeks investigating Jesus's crucifixion. So, and I'm sorry for that. I hate that I'm going to stop right in the middle of the crucifixion, but yeah, we'll just. I think it's worthy of at least 2 weeks, don't you?
Mhm.
All right. Well, good. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed for tonight. Thank you for all your input tonight. It's been a blessing.